Thank you guys very much. We're going to go ahead and jump into our passage today. Don't have a scripture reading to transition right now because we already did that. So we're going to be in Mark chapter 6 this morning, so I encourage you to turn there. If you've been with us, we've been following through the Gospel of Mark, and the whole idea here is we want to see Jesus. We want to know who Jesus is. That's why you go to a gospel. Think of a biography, someone writing. We've seen this. John Mark is a close follower and companion of Peter. As you're reading John Mark, you're almost reading Peter's gospel. And you're getting the understanding of these people that follow Jesus well to understand what was the story of his life. Who is this man really, and what makes him tick? And so we've been talking about this at quite some length. Who is Jesus? And today I want us to go beyond just who he is to what motivates him. So if we're looking at who he is, we see that he is referred to as the Son of Man and the Son of God. Son of Man meaning he is human, but not just a human, he is the human. He is the human that actually lives a perfect life and loves the Father with all of his heart, mind, and soul, and loves his neighbors as himself. He is the human, and he is also the Son of God. He is God himself. He is both of these things. He has described himself and been described this way throughout Mark. He is also the one who forgives sins, declaring himself to be God himself. He's a physician to the sick. He is a Lord and King, but not a Lord and King that tries to get power and prestige to himself. He is a Lord and King that serves others, that gives of his wealth for the extent of other people. His kingship is seen in the fact that he has authority over nature itself, that he has authority over evil, that he has authority over life. And so we'll see here in that understanding of who he is, what is it that motivates Jesus? And so let's jump into our section. Very common story that we see here. It says, the people saw them going, and many recognized them, and they ran together on foot from all the cities, and they got there ahead of them. So if you remember last week when we left off, you had the disciples needed to get away. So the disciples had come back from their 2x2 journey out, right? Jesus sent them all out 2x2 to go out to different cities to proclaim the gospel, to let people know that Jesus is here. They should repent, come to God. And so they all come back, and Jesus is like, you guys are wiped out. We need to get away from all the people, all the chaos. We need to go take a breather, reconnect, that kind of thing. So he has them get in a boat, and they're going across the water. The story says here that the people saw that they were going in the boat across the water. They recognized them. They ran together on foot from all the cities ahead of them. This is a crazy story if you think about it. Like the Sea of Galilee is not like a tiny little lake. It's a lake, but it's a sea. It's a big body of water. And they're seeing the people, the crowd that want him. Jesus, the only way to get away is to get into a boat. And the crowd sees him in the boat and his disciples in the boat, and they're like, let's go, guys, let's go get him. And it says they're running on the shore, keeping up with the boat. And as they're running on the shore to keep up with the boat, they're stopping in all the cities. People from every city are coming out. And they're all running together ahead of Jesus' boat. So by the time Jesus' boat gets away into the wilderness to get away to pray, to relax, to rest, a massive crowd is there because they've been running on the seashore, on the land to get there. That's a crazy story. Crazy, just try to picture that, right? So Jesus in verse 34, it says, when Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd and began to teach them many things. So Jesus steps off the boat, he sees this massive crowd, and his heart is moved. He had compassion. So like we're understanding a lot of the details of who Jesus is. In this story, you're starting to see his heart, his inner being, his character, who he is. He is a man of great compassion. Compassion, the idea of pity or love or great affection or deep empathy. You know, the idea I was acknowledging just a few minutes ago, right? Mother's Day this year is hard for me. Like, I can actually express some empathy with people that are going through this. I can, to some extent, understand the heaviness and difficulty that Mother's Day can be from time to time for certain people. Like, to be empathetic, to be compassionate, to be loving, to have deep affection for another person, that when you see the pain of what they're going is, you feel some of the pain that they're going through. Jesus felt that. It was important for him to get away with his disciples. They have been burning the candle on both ends. They're wiped out. They need recharge. They need relationship with the Creator. But when they get there and see this crowd, Jesus' heart is moved. His compassion is moved. His heart is moved towards them. And I think in there, like just the thought of like, How has Jesus been compassionate towards you? How has God been compassionate towards you? How has he shown that to you? How have other people shown compassion to you? How is it God wants to use you to show compassion to another person? Jesus is moved to the depth, the core of his being. He's moved with compassion. And the specifics of his compassion, what he sees is, he says they're like sheep without a shepherd. There's nobody to protect them. There's nobody to feed them. There's nobody to care for them. All these people, and nobody's there to care for these people. The idea of sheep and shepherd is a sheep is a type of animal that without the shepherd, without the protection of the shepherd, they're kind of at a loss. The predators will come and destroy them if there's no one there to defend them. They will not know where the green grass is to feed on if the shepherd doesn't lead them to the green grass. They will not know where the water is to quench their thirst if the shepherd's not bringing them to the water to have their thirst quenched. Like, they need a shepherd, they need a guide, they need someone to walk them there, to protect them, to guide them. And Jesus is looking at all the people and he's like, they don't have anybody doing that. You ever feel like that sometimes yourself? Like you're just going alone, you're fighting alone, like I don't have anyone watching after me, caring for me. Jesus has compassion on the people because they're just out there alone in a wilderness, fighting on their own, and they have no one to care for them. They don't have a shepherd, a guide, a protector, someone to feed them, to lead them. And it says, so he began to teach them many things. Jesus' primary ministry with people is one of teaching. It's the idea of helping them understand the very nature of God, the very heart of God, to help them understand their place in the world, to understand why they were created by God, how they can find their purpose. His primary role is that of teaching, to guiding, to giving new knowledge and truth. And he sits there and teaches them many things. Like, I can imagine what that is. I'd want to just be able to sit in the wilderness there with Jesus and just have him sit and teach over, just for hours, just sitting there teaching. The thought that I would have is it's very similar probably to the Sermon on the Mount or teachings like that we have of Jesus's. He's teaching them many things. It says in verse 35 that when it was already late, the disciples came up to him and said, this place is secluded, it's a wilderness, it's a desert, and it's already late. Send them away that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages to buy themselves something to eat. So the disciples are noticing something, they're being highly practical. There's thousands of people out here. What we'll see later in the story, it says 5,000 men. That word men can be either human or male. And so if it is meaning male, that means that it is 5,000 males, most likely children and women with them, upwards of 20,000 possibly. It could also be 5,000 humans, or it could be 20,000. Either way, this is a large, massive crowd that left the comfort of the city. They went out to the wilderness on a run to get there in Jesus so they could just sit there and listen to him teach. I just imagine how their soul is filled as they're listening to Jesus teach. And the disciples are like, okay, let's get practical here, Jesus, for a minute. We're out in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing here for these people. You need to stop teaching them. It's time to send them away because they need to go get some food somewhere. It's time for that. And Jesus' response to them is he says, verse 37, but he answered them, you give them something to eat. I imagine, what do you thought there as a disciple when Jesus says, okay, accurate point, they need some food, and there's no food out here. You feed them, the 5,000 to 20,000 people. When do you gather that kind of crowd? What is that? There's a couple different high schools in our area, maybe 3 different high schools worth of people in our area if it's on the 5,000 side. If it's on the 20,000 side, this is like a concert venue. This is like Climate Pledge Arena or something. There's a lot of work that goes into providing for those humans when they all gather together like that. There are bathrooms, there are foods. If you go to Climate Pledge or something like that, there's well thought out procedures because they know what humans need when they're in that kind of gathering. These guys are just out in the wilderness. And so Jesus says to them, you provide for them. You give them the food. Their response is something similar to probably much of what our response might be. They say to him, shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give it to them to eat? Well, now, I guess at some level you might think just logistics. How can I? Where can I get this food? But their thought is, that's too much money. I don't have enough money to provide for the food of what this is. 200 denarii. A denarii is essentially a day's wage in their time. This is 200 days' wages is what it would cost to feed this group just one meal. I tried to do a little bit of work. If I'm basing off averages in our area, I'm thinking it's roughly about $80,000 in our area. It's a bit of a guess. I'm not a mathematician, I'm a pastor. So what I think is the idea is roughly, it's a large sum of money is what I'm getting at. They're looking at this saying, either we don't have the money or we can't spend all of our money on that, is what they're wrestling with. You ever have struggles in life with thinking about whether or not you're going to have enough finances to make it? I think this is a common struggle to humanity. Do we have enough money to survive? How are we going to make it through the day? How are we going to provide the thing that we need to provide? Their first thought is to go to money and provision. I think that's natural for many of us. It's made me think this last week. I really don't worry about my financial situation from a family perspective. I've told you many times, I grew up poor, and I understand that our family could do with a whole lot less and still be very happy in life. And I'm more so thankful and grateful for God's provision than I am worried about whether or not there will be a loss of provision. If there's a loss of provision, I think there's a whole long ways we could go before we'd be really hurting. And even in that scenario, so my worries don't really, on a financial level, don't go to a personal level. But can I admit, as I'm wrestling through this last week, I think I do struggle with fear and anxiety and stress when it comes to a church financial wrestle. That, I have, in my role, I have two things that I'm responsible for to some level is my family and my church. And the family seems like I can manage and see that. The church sometimes is like, I don't know. I don't know if there's going to be enough. Is there going to be enough? Is there going to be enough for what I hope God would do? Is there going to be enough for, those are wrestles and struggles that I actually have. And the disciples are wrestling with something similar. I wonder what your wrestle might be in there. Do we have enough? These guys are saying, I don't have 80,000, or I can't spend the whole 80,000 because then we don't have enough to survive, is what the wrestle is here. And essentially what this is lesson time for the disciples, and I think subsequently then lesson time for us. It says here that Jesus says to them in verse 38, "How many loaves do you have? Go look." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And he ordered them all to recline in many groups on the green grass. They reclined in groups of hundreds and fifties. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking upward to heaven, he blessed the food, broke the loaves, and gave it to the disciples again and again to set before them. And he divided the 2 fishes among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. Now, remember this here. Jesus is coming to this crowd that he is moved with compassion because they need someone to feed them, someone to protect them, someone to guide them, someone to be there for them, and Jesus is going to provide. He starts off with teaching. What they need is truth. What they need is guidance. What they need is to understand the truth and reality of God, but I'm also going to feed them. Like a good shepherd, I'm going to lead them beside still waters. I'm going to lead them into green pastures so that they have the ability to eat and drink and be satisfied. And he says to the disciples, you feed them. And their response, like most of us would be, is practically, I can't make it happen. I don't have the money, or I'm not willing to spend the money to make that happen, Jesus. And Jesus essentially says, it's beautiful how he says it. He says, make them gather. Like the shepherd is even like organizing the whole scenario. Make them sit in groups of 50 and 100. And he says, make them sit in groups of 50 and 100 on the green grass. I love, the green grass should be a trigger for us, thinking of Psalms and leading beside still water, helping them like in the pastures. Like the shepherd is feeding his people. He's organizing them. He's teaching them. He's feeding them. He's being a shepherd to them. He's caring for them. He's compassionate towards them. And he says, the guys have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. And Jesus, specifically in the whole story, says he looks up to heaven and he blesses it. The idea of looking up to heaven is he's reminding them where this comes from. You're about to see what and they don't know it, but they're about to see God miraculously provide for these 5 to 20,000 people. And he's going to make sure that the disciples know who's providing this. He thanks God. He looks up to heaven. He thanks God. He blesses God for what he's about to do. And he says he gave to them. He kept giving to them. The disciples, again and again, he sets it before them. So I get that picture of like, He's got the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and then he passes it to the disciples. Then he grabs it and passes it to the disciples. Then he grabs it and passes it to the disciples. And how does this just keep getting bigger? He just keeps grabbing it, and he just keeps giving it, and it just keeps coming, even though like there was only 5 and there was only 2 to start with, but he just keeps giving it out again and again and again and again, and he keeps giving it out till they all ate and were satisfied. They were fed, fatted, ate one's fill. They were full. It says that they picked up 12 baskets full of leftovers, of fragments that they picked up afterwards. Jesus is caring like a good shepherd, and he's reminding people, he's reminding his disciples and this crowd, as much as they can understand, that it's ultimately God who provides for you. Is that a hard thing for us to remember from time to time? I think it's really hard specifically when we work hard too, right? I work hard at my job. I work hard to provide for family. I know you do too. You work hard to provide for those that you love. So we've got a lot of skin in the game when it comes to gathering whatever wealth or whatever we have to provide for ourselves. What Jesus is reminding the disciples is ultimately God that gave the provision. It reminds me of a story that Moses says back in Deuteronomy. I feel like it's important for us to look at this passage real quick. Deuteronomy 8, 11, and 18. The story here in Deuteronomy is God's people have been, through Moses, led out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, wandering the wilderness. They're about to go into the promised land, and he's setting up his people to remember what God has done as you go into this land, is the context here. And he says to them in verse 11 of chapter 8, he says, "Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God by following his commandments, his ordinances, his statutes, which he commanded you today." So as you're going in, be careful not to forget what God's commanded you. "Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, and you build good houses and live in them, and when your herds and your flocks increase, and your silver and gold increase, and everything that you have increases, that your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who led you through the great and terrible wilderness with the fiery serpents and scorpions and its thirsty ground, and there was no water. He who brought water for you out of the rock with a flint in the wilderness, it was he who fed you with manna from your fathers, which your fathers did not know, in order to humble you." So what he's saying here is, when you go into the land and you start eating and have satisfaction, when you build good houses, when your herds and your flocks are increasing, when your silver and your gold are increasing, don't let your heart become proud and forget the Lord. It's easy to get that way sometimes, isn't it? When God is gracious and good and kind and abundance comes, it's easy to forget where that comes from. And he's saying, when you go there and you start living and you build your houses and you start having this comfortable, don't forget where you got that from, is what he's saying that. Don't become proud, and remember who brought you out of slavery. Remember who brought you through the waters in Egypt. Remember who gave you water in the wilderness. Remember the story of the wilderness journeys. They're wandering 40 years in the wilderness. No food, no water, no provision. They cannot take care of themselves. The only way they're going to provide or live and survive is if God takes care of them, if God provides for them. And in that story, you have a story where Moses comes and is told to strike a rock with his staff, and water bursts forth and pour forth so that they could drink water in a desert. In that story, you have the idea that God fed them birds falling out of the sky and a dew-like flower in the morning. They wouldn't have more than they needed. They couldn't set it aside and keep it for the next day. They would only have enough to provide what that daily rations were, but they knew that God was going to take care of them again the next day. 40 years, they were desperately only going to live and survive if God gave the flower on the dew and the birds of that day and the water of that day. Without that, they're dead. And he's trying to tell them, you're going to go into a land where you're going to build houses and have your resources are going to grow and your gold and silver are going to grow. It's going to be easy to forget who brought you there, who gave you this abundance. Easy to get proud instead of humble. And he says that your fathers, in order to humble you, in order to put you to the test, to do good to you in the end, that God is doing good by humbling us. Verse 17, here's, I think, the powerful verse. "Otherwise, you may say in your heart, my power and my strength of mine, my power and strength of my hand has made me this wealth. But you are to remember the Lord your God, for it is he who is giving you power to make wealth, in order to confirm his covenant that he swore with his fathers, as it is this day. It's easy to get to a point where we say in our hearts, it's my power and my strength that has acquired what I have. And what he's saying is, remember that it is God who has given you the power and the ability to make wealth. So it is a both and, right? You work hard. I work hard. It is God that's given us the ability to work hard. He's the one that's given the ability for my mind to work. He's the one that's given me the ability for my hands and my body to work. So while I need to be a good steward of what God has given to me, you and I need to be good stewards of those things. The reality is we cannot forget who provides. That's the story of what the disciples are wrestling with. They look at the crowd, 5,000 of them, 20,000 of them. We cannot do this. Either it will deplete all of our funds, or we don't have enough funds to do this. And Jesus is reminding them it's God who provides. The people are in the wilderness, and God is going to provide, just like he did through Moses back in the wilderness journey. These stories are like very similar and intended to be very similar. The people are wandering out in the wilderness, thousands of them. And the only way that they're going to get food is through the provision of God, who's going to take 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and he's going to provide for them. And so they can eat to the point where they are satisfied. The compassion of Jesus to see this crowd and to be moved with compassion towards them. And they picked up the 12 baskets full of pieces, and it says they were 5,000 men, so 5 to 20,000, depending on the understanding of the word men. Verse 45, a couple other stories here to just kind of compact this all together. Mark kind of hits so many different. I think we need to hit a couple for context's sake. He says immediately in verse 45, Jesus and his disciples got into a boat to go. He told his disciples to get in a boat to go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he himself dismissed the crowd. For after saying goodbye to them, he left them to a mountain to pray. The important piece is, remember the storyline. There was so much going on that Jesus said, we need to get away, we need to find a chance, we need to go pray. And what happens is he gets to the shore and there's tons of people there, and his heart is moved that I have to serve these people, I have to care for these people, I have to shepherd these people. And so he teaches them, he feeds them, he spends the whole day still pouring out. But he still needs to get away. He hasn't lost the importance of needing to get away. Do you ever get that point? Like you're just pouring out, you're pouring out, you're pouring out, and you know you need a break. You know you need to reconnect with God. You know you need something, but then you're like, oh, but there's this thing. I have to do this thing. And then you pour out more and more. And then the next thing comes and you pour out more and more. And the next thing comes and you pour out more and more. Before you know it, you're no longer spending the time with God to recharge and re-get your purpose and let God fill your soul to be able to pour out. I've told this story before, but when I was minister, I was a youth minister for 6 years in a church in Illinois. I've been here for 13 years. That time period in Illinois for 6 years, it was so life-filling. The pace of ministry and everything else was just God could just fill my soul. I felt like I was just being dumped in with spiritual health and fulfillment with what was going on there. Now, I was a little bored. I needed God needed me out to go do something else too. And so when I came out here and started doing ministry in this church 13 years ago, it was more like I got a tank full, and now I'm going to let it out. And I'm going to serve and care and do and push and move and care. And then I'm giving out. And what I didn't realize was it's starting to deplete, and I'm not putting in. I'm putting out, but I'm not putting in to fill it up. And there was a point in there where I realized oh, this is not a good. I'm going the opposite here. Where I felt full then, I'm running the tank a little low, and I'm not charging the battery. I'm not connecting with God. It's running low. And I remember telling the elders back in a season of time, this is not a good equation. I can see this happening, and I can tell this. And it was when I took a sabbatical 6 years ago. I'm taking one again this summer. When I took it 6 years ago, I remember telling the elders, maybe a year before I took it, this is not good. I can see that I'm running the tank low. But then there was a local church in our area that dissolved, and we we went from 100 people overnight to 200 plus people overnight. And it was a rotating 100 people every week that was coming to the Vine or Briar Church back in that day. And I'm looking at the scenario and I'm like, kind of like this, like compassion. I have to pour out. Like I can't go. And what I realized is I ran the tank too long, too much too long, and I crashed the last sabbatical that I had. I'm trying to say from experience, I think I understand what Jesus is going through here. And the wisdom, both that there are seasons and times where you're going to say, yeah, I'm going to pour, there is something in front of me that I have to pour out for. But that doesn't mean that he's not still going to have a high purpose and priority that I am going to get away. Jesus sends his disciples on the boat by themselves back, and he, it says, goes up to a mountain to pray. He is going to get his alone time. He is going to serve and pour out maybe when he's already like a little bit on the reserve tank. But he's still going to find his time to go out and pray, to be with the Father, to recharge, to find his purpose for what, to be filled himself that he can love and serve other people. I think there's so much to learn from Jesus in this. It says in verse 47 that when evening had come and the boat was in the middle of the sea, he was along the land, and seeing them straining at the oars and the wind was against them, it was about the fourth watch, which is 3 to 6 a.m. in the morning. He came to them walking on the sea. He intended to pass by them, but when he saw them walking on the sea, they thought he was a ghost, and they cried out, for they were all terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." He got into the boat, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished. So the story goes here, like Jesus is up in the mountain praying as the disciples are going back across the boat, away from the wilderness, back into the towns, back to Bethsaida, which is on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus decides, I'm going to walk along the path to see what they're doing here. But he defies gravity, right? Like when you step on water, you go into the water. Jesus steps on water, he doesn't go into the water, he walks on the water. Rightfully, this is freaking out the guys who see it. The guys are in the boat and they're seeing somebody walk on the water. That does not happen. Remember back, he's king. He's king with authority over nature itself. He's walking on the water and they're freaking out thinking this is a ghost, and they're terrified, as we all would be. And he says, "Take courage, guys." He gets in the boat, the wind stops, and they're all astonished. Again, these are just things that Jesus keeps doing. He keeps showing his kingdom. He keeps showing he's king with authority over nature itself, with authority over evil, with authority over life itself. He keeps showing these things as he's going through it. It says that for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves because their hearts were hardened. That's a weird line, isn't it? The disciples who are in the boat, who Jesus walks alongside, he says he's partially doing this because their hearts are hardened. They didn't gain any insight from the loaves. How do you not gain insight from the loaves? How do you not? How hardened can you be to see Jesus keep giving you bread and fish over and over and over again, and see him feed 20,000 or 5,000 people, to see 12 baskets full of fragments? Like, you watched all of this as you in the beginning were saying, hey, we don't have enough money to do this. Like, just send them away because we can't take care of this. Jesus did something miraculous. And it says that they were not impressed, essentially. They were not moved by it. These are the disciples, the 12 who are with him all the time, who are going to be the ones that found the church and push it forward, who write most of the scriptures that we have, who write what we're looking at today. Give yourself some grace is what I think. Right? If you're a little hard-hearted, a little jaded sometimes, if you got your struggles, like the disciples had it and they saw miraculous things. It makes me think of Thomas's thing, right? What is Thomas, after Jesus' resurrection, all the disciples are like, oh, he's resurrected from the dead. And Thomas is like, unless I can stick my hand in his side or touch the holes on his hand, I'm not believing. And Jesus comes up and says to him, Jesus goes to the room, and then he says, okay, Thomas, go for it. You want to stick your hand in the side? You want to put your fingers in the hole on my hands? Go for it. He shows himself. He gives compassion to Thomas, who doubts. Jesus is compassionate. He's willing to work with your doubts. And he says to Thomas, he says, hey, you're extremely blessed to be able to see and believe what you're seeing here. Even greater belief or blessing is to those who don't see and believe. Thomas and the disciples were blessed because they could see the resurrected Jesus and believe. There's a blessing of God for them to be able to be a part of that. You know what's an even greater blessing? A greater blessing than what they got there is the fact that you believe today. It is a greater blessing of God that you cannot stick your hands in his side, that you do not get to see the resurrected Jesus like they did, and yet you still believe. That belief is a blessing from God. So give ourselves a little break from time to time. The disciples saw the thousands of people fed, and they're still not gaining insight from the event because they had a hard-hearted or unwillingness, closedness of mind, unwillingness to learn. I'll end with this last little story here. It says, when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret, and they moored at the shore, and they got out of the boat, and immediately the people recognized him. And they ran about the entire country and began carrying here and there on pallets those who were sick to wherever they had heard he was. And wherever he entered a village or a city or a countryside, they were laying the sick people in the marketplace and imploring him that they might touch the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were being healed. The reason I think it's important to throw this story on is like back into ministry, right? The disciples were out ministering 2 by 2. They came back. They needed refreshment. Jesus went out to these crazy people run along the shore as they're in the boat, and they get there before him, and he's moved with compassion. Like, know that the heart of Jesus is one of compassion and love, and he sees the need of people, and he's going to pour himself out for that. That not at the expense of still getting away to the mountain and praying. And the recharge, the reconnect with God, the where he gets his purpose from, and then he's back in the grind again. He's back on the other side of the lake, and people are coming from everywhere with people on pallets, ready to just touch the garment. Where did they get that from? Remember the story that we saw a little while ago, the lady who was trying to sneak through the crowd? If I could just touch his garment. Why else would they be trying to do that unless that lady went out and said, hey guys, if you just touch his garment, you'll be healed. And it says they're coming to touch his fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed or delivered or rescued. Like, they were physically healed. But remember, Jesus' primary purpose is one of a shepherd for sheep who are lost, who need teaching, who need direction. And so he rescues them, he heals them, he delivers them. He is a good shepherd who is moved with compassion for his sheep. The story, the primary thing of all the story is for us, there's so many different nuggets for us to really glean from this. But the primary piece is you have a compassionate God. This king of the entire universe, who has authority over nature itself, over life itself, over evil, over everything else. He is moved with compassion for people who need truth and guidance and provision and care. He is a good shepherd who sees where you're at, and he's coming to heal and to take care of you, to rescue and deliver you. This is not just something Jesus did 2,000 years ago. Jesus rose from the dead, as I told about with the Thomas story. Jesus is alive today. He sees the hurt. He sees the loneliness, the struggle, the financial woes, the whatever. He sees it all, and he is a good shepherd who's going to come in and walk and guide and protect and lead us if we'll let him do so. If we're not like the disciples were, where they were hard-hearted and not moved, let our hearts be moved by Jesus. The one thing I think we can do is open our hearts to the truth of Jesus so that he can come in and shepherd and guide and direct our souls and our lives. Let's go ahead and pray. Father, we come to you this morning as the good shepherd. As the good shepherd that, as we even saw earlier in our child dedications, the one that creates life. You created every life in this room today. The uniqueness that each one of us are, the things that we think, the things that move us, the thing that's important. Like, you created the uniqueness of all of us. Thank you for being the author of life. Thank you for being a God with compassion that sees your people without a shepherd, and you'll step in to care. Lord, I pray that you would do a powerful work in my heart and the hearts of the people in your church to draw us to yourself, to help us to see your love and compassion for us, that we might be drawn into opening up our hearts to you. That we would not have a hard-heartedness towards you, but that we would see you working in our lives and the lives of those around us. We would draw to you in faith and trust, and we would let you shepherd and guide our lives. Lord Jesus, may you work in my heart and the hearts of the people in your church today. We love you and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.